Good day. You're welcome to Mktg 305 Consumer Behavior. My name is Dr. Prince Kodria. Today we'll focus on section 11 and we'll be looking at social class influences on consumer decision making. In this section, we'll try to look at the influences of social class on consumption-related behavior of consumers. And then we should be concerned, or we'll also be concerned with how marketers can apply this knowledge for marketing strategies. Specifically, we'll look at social class as determinant of purchasing behavior. We'll also look at some characteristics of social class. We'll look at the structure of social class and how to measure it. And just like we always do, we'll look at the marketing implications or ramifications. I expect you to read the chapter on social class. Where possible, I also direct you via Sakai to read other relevant materials. Now, social class as a determinant of purchasing behavior. You realize that in every society there are variations in terms of wealth, material possession, power, authority, prestige, among other considerations among people. And these factors create some kind of divisions or barrier among people living in a given community. One's purchasing habits as a consumer is a social class, in terms of the factors that influence habits as consumers, is a social class that we find ourselves or one that we belong to. Now, let's attempt some kind of definition. We'll say that social class refers to the classification of members of a society into a hierarchy of distinct status classes in which members of a class have relatively the same status and members of the other classes have either or more or less status. In other words, social class refers to a kind of hierarchy based on certain factors that I mentioned earlier on, whereby we are able to, in relative terms, we are able to say that this class is more important than this. So is the actions they take as consumers. We can also say that social class refers to groups of people with similar wealth, influence, and status. And of course, all things being equal, we expect people within a given social stratum to have similar tastes and characteristics and likely to behave similarly with regards to a given marketing offer. Hawking et al. 2011 defines social class as a hierarchical division of society into relatively distinct and homogeneous groups with respect to attitudes, values, and lifestyle. What does this mean? All we are saying is that people within a given social stratum tend to exhibit or tend to have similar attitudes, values, lifestyle. They tend to be homogeneous in a lot of factors, and therefore, as marketers, this is of importance to us because that can serve as basis for market segmentation. In marketing, consumer need is the basis for which we segment, and we are saying that social class is one of such factors that helps us to do that kind of stratification in terms of consumer needs, because in a given market, you're likely to have consumers with heterogeneous needs, but the use of social class allow us to focus our marketing effort because people within a given social stratum tend to have similar needs and therefore likely to respond in a given way with regards to our marketing offer. We're also saying that family is a family social class is determined by the opportunities presented to them and the level of material possession they have. Why are we saying this? For instance, individuals in our communities who are well educated or have prestigious occupations like lecturers, doctors, lawyers, tend to be accorded much or more status relative to other occupational groupings. The more status that we accord a given person tend to mean that that person wields enormous power relative to others. Typically, we rank social class from low status to high status. In other words, in a given society, based on certain factors that I've mentioned earlier on, we can divide people in the community or society as low with regards to those factors that are important to us. So members of one social class usually tend to think that the members of other social classes either have higher or lower status than they do, because it provides basis for comparison based on wealth, education, occupation, and what have you. In this regard, people tend to rely on cues to suggest that others have equal status as they do, or lower status than they do, or higher status than they do. In other words, based on one's occupation or education, one is able to make a kind of comparison to say that this person is of higher status or lower status, as the case may be. As marketers, we are interested in the study of social class because it reflects the consumption choices and patterns of consumers. They tend to have, people within a given social stratum tend to exhibit similar behavior in relation to our marketing mix elements. Sometimes consumers purchase certain products because they are preferred ones by members of their own social class or by members of a higher social class. But usually we want to avoid goods and services that they think belong to a lower social class. In other words, consumers typically will buy goods and services that they think reflect their social standing or social class, and sometimes buy those that they believe will make them to be perceived as belonging to a higher social class. For instance, a high-priced branded item of designer items such as clothing, perfumes, etc., are typically perceived by many as meant for people of the higher class, while low-priced brands of no-name items are perceived to be of lower class. Typically, highly branded items are perceived as meant for the high class. Social status, a related concept. It simply refers to the degree of prestige that members of one social class holds in comparison with members of other social classes. There's always some basis for comparison. So factors such as power, wealth, and esteem are in consideration in this regard. So power influences the level of, the degree of influence one social class tend to have over the other one. People usually want to compare their own material possession to determine their social class relative to others. This is particularly the case where, or in societies where material possessions are revered or respected, such as in the United States of America and also our own country, Ghana. In this regard, people having more purchasing power have more status than those with low purchasing power. Apart from material possession, other factors or demographics that defines one's social standing are education, qualifications, and occupational status. Now, let's look at some characteristics of social class. Each social class tends to have sets of unique behavior or behaviors that makes the concept of social class of interest to marketers. Because of the uniqueness of people within a given social stratum, marketers tend to be interested in social class. It is of essence for marketers to know when social class is an influencing factor and when it is not in their marketing activities. In other words, sometimes social class will influence consumer decision making. It's not in all cases. For a social class to be determined, 5 criteria must exist. In other words, they must be bounded, they must be ordered, it must be mutually exclusive, it must be exhaustive and influential. Let's look at what we mean. Bounded. What do we mean by bounded? In other words, it should be possible for us to make clear breaks between each social class. There should be something to make us say that this is a lower social class or this is a higher social class. It must also be ordered. Based on certain criteria or measures, such as prestige or status, we are able to determine social class as low or as high. It must be mutually exclusive. In other words, an individual should belong to one social class at a given point in time, based on the factors we've enumerated. However, we need to know that it's possible for one to move from one social class to the other, based on certain changes in those factors that determine social class. And it must also be exhaustive. In other words, each member of society must fit into some class. An individual in a society cannot be classless because all these factors exist. It should be possible for us to put people in social classes based on education and other factors. It should also be influential. In other words, belonging to a given social class or social stratum should influence our behavior in the marketplace. This is why marketers are interested in social class. And we also say that it should be multidimensional. In other words, determination of one social class is based on more than one criteria or criterion. The social class structure. Typically, we can have upper class, we can have the middle class, and we can have the lower class. In generic terms, we can put people in these various classes. But it's important for us to know that we can still divide these classes further based on certain factors. Okay. The upper class, for instance, has 3 subdivisions which are based on occupation and social affiliations. The middle class is also subdivided into white-collar workers, blue-collar workers, and the working class. The lower class has also 2 subdivisions. Those who are living a little above the poverty line, which we call the lower upper, and those who are poverty-stricken, the lower, the poorest in society. So you can look at the various classifications, the upper class, look at the characteristics. You can look at the upper class. There are some peculiar characteristics that will help us to classify one under the upper class. We can also have the lower upper class. We are saying that there are families that are relatively new in terms of being part of the upper class social status and have not yet been accepted by upper crust of the community. They are also referred to as the new rich. Members of the lower upper class are families that have acquired wealth in the current generation. Okay, so you can read on and then you can come to the upper middle class. This refers to those or families who neither possess family status resulting from heritage nor possess uncommon wealth. Then you can look at the middle class. Typically, it consists of white-collar workers, such as teachers, office workers, and lower-level managers. Highly paid blue-collar workers also fall under this category, of class. We can also look at white color groups and the top of the blue color groups. We can also look at the working class, which typically consists of skilled and unskilled factory, service, and sales workers. You can see the lower class with its characteristics. So we can further look at lower class. And typically we say is the largest social class segment of many countries. I mean, especially the poor and developing countries. The people who do mostly the hard work fall within this class. What is important about this division is that they tend to have similar characteristics in terms of taste and preferences, and of course their demand or their motivation to purchase goods and services, and therefore of significant importance to marketers. Now, how do we measure social class? There are several ways or different ways by which we can measure one social class or to determine one social class. We can either do it subjectively or objectively, or we can do what we call multivariable measures, where we put together or we measure social class based on two or more factors. Subjective measures of social class. How do we do this? We do this by asking individuals or people to evaluate their own social classes. In other words, we allow people to make judgment of their own social class. Though it's useful, we are saying that using the subjective measures tend to lead to people estimating their social classes incorrectly. I mean, it tends to be the word is subjective. So it creates a situation where people put themselves in the wrong social classes based on those factors that we use in measuring social class. It has to do with self-perception and sense of belonging or identification. In other words, individuals will do this in comparison with others. They will look at others and then place themselves as of higher or lower social standing. This leads to what we call social class consciousness. In other words, the person becomes aware that he or she belongs to a particular social class, what we call social class consciousness. The objective measures, typically we use variables such as occupational prestige, education, and income. Occupational prestige may vary from one jurisdiction or community or country to country. It varies because various occupations are accorded certain respect or prestige or attract some kind of reputation. So based on occupation, we are able to determine one social class. For instance, a judge in most communities will be put on a higher social class or standing than, say, a factory worker. So occupational prestige simply means measuring social class based on the status or the prestige that the community attaches to various occupations, list of occupations. And therefore, it also ranges from low to high. But we also need to be aware that although it's a good measure of social class, it varies from country to country or from one jurisdiction to the other, because different communities attach different level of importance to various occupations. And therefore, marketers need to be able to adapt if they are to use social class in various markets based on what is important in the given market. You can read on to give us more understanding of how to measure social class using occupational prestige or ranking. Another measure is using education. This one, to all things being equal, the belief is that somebody with higher education is placed on a higher social class, and typically they tend to have similar, people with similar education tend to have similar characteristics and also tend to have about the same or similar disposable income, or fall within the same income bracket, and therefore, again, this classification may be useful to marketers in certain regards. Of course, the case may vary in some instances. In today's economy, for instance, education clearly drives income. So social class membership is usually reflected in one's education. Education determines wages in several countries. In this era, traditional high-paying manufacturing jobs that demanded relatively little education are disappearing. And getting a high-paying job in the manufacturing and services sector demands that one has technical skills, abstract skills, and the ability to read and learn new skills quickly. And these skills that we are talking about are typically acquired through education. So people who do not have these skills tend to fall on a lower social class and tend to have lower incomes, and therefore their behavior in the marketplace tend to be different. We can also talk of income. We can talk of the income of an individual or household. This can be used as a measure of social class. But what is important is that we need to always consider the source of income and the amount of income when we are to use income as a measure of social class. We need to also make distinction between income and wealth. Income here, we are saying that is a revenue that accrues to an individual on a regular basis, usually due to a work that the person has done or performed. Wealth, on the other hand, is based on savings and may include inheritance and often expand over generation. Of course, wealth can be used to create more financial resources by way of investment. Some are of the opinion that income is not a good measure of social class. The thinking is that a more educated individual and a less educated person might both earn the same amount of income. But what is different here is that they are likely to spend it differently due to differences in their educational level. In other words, the kind of items an individual buys is a reflection of one's social class. For instance, a lecturer who holds a doctorate degree and an auto mechanic who is a senior high school graduate may be earning the same income, say $6,000 per month. But the difference here is that they are likely to spend it differently. That is why this is of importance to marketers by way of market segmentation. The amount one receives or the consumer receives reflects or influences his or her ability to spend. But it is not the representation of how the money is spent. How money is spent typically is as a result of differences in priorities based on all the factors we've talked about, education, occupation, and all that, tend to give us differences in terms of what is important to us. We can also look at what we call the multivariable measures. Here we simply put together two or more of the factors to determine one social class. Some believe that this method of measurement better reflects the complex nature of social class than using a single variable index. Of course, the reasons are obvious. The most commonly used multivariable measures are the following. We have the index of status characteristics, which is based on occupation, source of income, area of abode, and the house one is living, the house type one is living in. We can also talk of the socio-economic status score. This measures three socio-economic variables: income, family income, and educational attainment. So the marketer will need to determine which one is more relevant with regard to a given marketing strategy. What we need to know that there are some challenges with the social class system in today's contemporary world. In the past, the social class concept worked perfectly for marketing strategy. However, we need to know that shifts in social patterns is making much of its assumptions less relevant today. The assumptions in the past were okay, but now, because of changes in the marketplace, some of those assumptions are no more useful. What are we talking about? The assumption that skilled manual workers earn lesser than administrative workers does not hold in these modern times, especially in an economy like ours, where unemployment is rampant. So a skilled manual worker, such as a mechanic, might be earning more than an administrator of a firm. The high rate of unemployment, some firms are taking some graduates for granted by paying them less for the work they do. So grouping people based on these factors can be a bit challenging. Also, the classification usually considers the head of the household, which might have been a reasonable idea many decades ago. That this 21st century, we need to realize that many people in the household could be earning, and not as in the past where we only have maybe the father who is a breadwinner and others look up to him. Some might even be earning more than the head of the family. So this scenario dilutes the decision making in terms of purchasing. In terms of implication, marketers are particularly interested in social class because it has some relationship with the consumer purchasing patterns. Marketers also believe that there's a high correlation between purchasing patterns and consumer social class. In this regard, marketers tend to apply the concept of social class in explaining consumption-related behavior. In more specific terms, we can say that social class predicts the buying behavior, particularly the store selection of people belonging to different classes. For instance, the same product or brand may be purchased from different outlets by members of different social classes. The same product, but people are likely to buy from different places depending on their social class. In other words, the differences lies in the environment of the shop. For instance, lower class people avoid status stores and prefer shops where they get discounts and also get familiar with the retailers for issues of credit and what have you. Social class is also useful in terms of media usage, because people within a given social stratum tend to have similar media habits, and therefore will be useful in terms of targeting. Studies have indicated that people of higher classes tend to spend much of their leisure time reading magazines and books, listening to radios, going to movies, and what have you. They usually spend less time watching television. In contrast, people typically in the lower classes, read more fiction books, general women's magazines, and general news stories, and spend much time in front of television. And therefore, this is a useful information for segmentation and targeting, and of course, positioning as well. In this regard, we can say that it will be prudent to, for instance, advertise a luxurious car in a magazine or radio than on television, since those who can afford to do do not spend time watching television. Of course, we talk of integrated marketing communication. We may use magazines and other forms, but television as a medium is also useful for other considerations because we are able to show motion, sound, visuals, and so on and so forth. Social class is useful because advertising and promotional messages are responded to differently by different social classes and are also perceived differently by people belonging to different social classes. For instance, promotional messages containing connotative meaning are not well understood by members of the lower class, and consequently, they do not take interest in such messages. Again, symbols and words used in advertising messages are also interpreted differently by people of different social orientation or social classes. Therefore, the concept of social class is useful to marketers in designing appropriate advertising and promotional messages. In other words, we don't have to market all brands to all people. The purchase of brands of hard goods such as furniture, appliances, and automobiles are influenced by the social class of the buyer. The upper class usually would display a pattern of buying renowned, expensive, and unique brands because image is of importance to them, unlike people in the lower classes who are concerned with bread and butter matters. In conclusion, we can say that marketers must be very aware of the social class of their target market because it will help them put their marketing effort towards the various social classes. When this is done well, it will help meet the expectation of the various classes in terms of quality, service, and of course, atmosphere, among other factors. There's the need to also understand that social class is dynamic, and therefore, marketers need to be in a continuous state of flux in response to the changes that are taking place in terms of shift in social class. Yeah, you may look at these references for further reading. Thank you.